Hello, Jeff Dollar here. In previous videos, we examined the F in the new IFB, the fundamental, the term fundamentalist. Does this group have the authority to claim itself to be fundamental? We went back to the original fundamentals in the early 20th century. We looked at that and the doctrines that were taught there, the people who put those together, who were the original fundamentalists. We came to the conclusion that this particular group does not fit into that category of being described as fundamentalists. Now, just as a reminder, the reason that I spend time focusing on this particular group is that it most represents the group that I came out of. I believe that any group that has been inspired or influenced by Jack Hyles Anderson College of the 1970s or 80s, is going to hold these particular characteristics that need to be dealt with, and they're going to cause certain things. There's going to be certain problems within churches and within pastors, within families, that are going to be the result of following this particular brand of fundamentalism, this what I call extreme fundamentalism, which is not truly fundamentalism at all, but a deviation, a doctrinal deviation, very serious doctrinal deviations in practice. And what I'd like to look at today is the I in the new independent fundamental Baptist movement. That is the term independent. Now, if you've been involved in independent churches of this nature, you've perhaps become accustomed to the power struggles, the personality conflicts that you see within the church government. People jostle for positions of influence that cause chaos within the church. Now, my original church, the church that I came from before I went to Hyles Anderson, still exists, and I have relatives that are still involved in the church. One is a deacon within the church, and I hear the horror stories that there are still people there who are influenced by Jack Hyles. One deacon in particular actually terrorizes the other deacons. He's gotten into people's faces and screaming and yelling and threatening. Churches are always going to have such diatrophies, and they're going to have to be dealt with regardless of the system you have in place. But certain systems are better able to deal with these diatrophies rather than giving them voice, giving them positions of authority where they can wreak havoc within the church. The church is able to deal with them better in other systems, even in independent churches, true independent churches. There's a capability of dealing with them. But this particular movement, the new IFB, seems to be a breeding ground for these diatrophies, and they're able to rise up into the higher positions of power and wreak havoc there. Now, there are basically three philosophies of church government. You have the congregational. Now, that is the most democratic, I guess you'd say. These, however, are prone to dictatorship, as in democracies. Our government, for example, the United States government, is not a true democracy. The Founding Fathers viewed democracy as a very dangerous form of government. So the closer you get to pure democracy within a congregation, the more dangers there are of chaos or of a prominent personality, the most charismatic. I mean that not theologically, but the most charismatic of the personality, the most influential personality will usually rise to the top, and they will be looked at as the leader. So a Diotrephes is able to get involved in these groups and use their charm and their powerful personalities to gain control and to do whatever they wish within these groups that are truly independent. You also have what would be called the Presbyterian form of government. That is ruled not by one man, a pastor, or a congregation by democracy, but a representative form of government. The congregation chooses elders, and the elders then are the ones making the decisions based on the church constitution, based on the statement of faith. And the church is run not by one man or by the whole congregation, but by a group of elders, which I think is the most biblical. And then you have the Episcopalian form of government. where you have several men who are in charge, overseeing, without the input of the congregation. They basically just rule the congregation like a pope does, like cardinals. There are various degrees of overlapping within these groups. Some groups have forms of congregationalism and the elder rule of the Presbyterians and Episcopalianism. So there's some of them are completely defined in that. You may have variations of these different types. Well, I'm the pastor of an independent church, and this church is run by a board of elders. I am one of the elders. I am the teaching elder. I'm a teaching elder and a ruling elder. We have some elders that aren't primarily teachers. They're able to teach, but their function in the church is not primarily teaching, as mine would be. These men are the ones who are in charge of overseeing the church spiritually. And if there's issues in the church, for example, this COVID-19 issue that we're facing, I didn't unilaterally make decisions as to not to hold church services or when to start church services. I go to the board of elders. We discuss these things, and we come up with a conclusion. We sat down as a congregation, or not as a board of elders, discussed the issue, and determined that we're going to follow the dictates of our governor for at least for a particular period of time. That's been going on for several weeks now. We're now meeting again as a group of elders. I'm not going to just simply unilaterally decide that we're now going to start meeting together again. I'm going to the elders. The elders are the ones that have the authority, not just the pastor. I don't go to the congregation. Now I get some input from the congregation, but primarily it's the elders that we have in our church is independent, but it functions under a group of elders. Now I'm involved in a denomination, which is a group of churches. There are several churches that are independent churches that have come together under a doctrinal standard, under a what we call a church discipline of rules of how we are to function as ministers. They don't have authority over our church. Our church is not involved in the denomination. I am as the minister, but they function as independents, and there's supervision of the pastors, some supervision of that, but it is primarily a group of independents. Each church within this group is autonomous to a certain degree. You own your own property. You call your own pastor. But if you deviate from certain things, a certain doctrine or practice, then that church may be removed or decide to leave. It's all voluntary. So there are certain limitations within this group. Every independent church that I have functioned in has always called its own pastors. I've never seen the chaos and confusion that you see published for the whole world on YouTube from this particular group called the New IFB. Now, the problem, however, is it does not occur by accident. It just didn't all of a sudden appear, and this group has been afflicted by this, by accident. The reason is, first of all, it goes back to the original video concerning fundamentalism, that they have left the fundamentals of the faith. They are not historically even Christian. They are historically more Pelagian and anti-Christian in their doctrine than what they would be Christian. And so these doctrines, whenever you deviate from proper doctrine, you're going to deviate in how you live and how the church functions. And also their churches are not truly independent. They do not even offer the freedom that a Presbyterian church and its form of government would offer to the congregation. The problems within the new IFB, I think you can see in three different areas. One is in the oversight of the churches. Another is in the calling of the pastors, and another would be in the dismissal of the church members, and what they would call church discipline. When you look at the oversight of the churches, it is a common practice to put one pastor in charge of several churches at the same time. There's maybe 3 or even 4 churches, a pastor, and these churches will be geographically separated. It would be very difficult for a pastor to get there. It would take much time to travel to these other churches. So it's not something he could have access to on a daily basis even, where it would take the pastor is not there watching over the congregation. The pastor has some control over the finances, it appears, control over who's teaching, but other than that, he's not there overseeing the churches. And no church can truly be led this way. A real pastor needs to have this contact. Now, a pastor cannot just simply pop in on occasion and preach and then leave the church in the hands of somebody else. There is multiple areas of temptation for abuse in this practice. For example, the finances. And we've seen financial issues that are, and the sad thing is this is published for the whole world to see. So I am not taking any information and spreading it that the world doesn't already know about this group. Whenever you have one man in charge of several churches receiving the financial tithes that are coming from these churches and controlling them, there's always the temptation for abuse of power. This is one of the things that led to the Reformation. You can go back half a millennium, and you can see that this was being abused within the Roman Catholic Church. One bishop would hold authority over several churches. During the time of Luther, there was abuses within the church of what we call today simony, which comes from the scripture, Simon who wanted to buy the power of the Holy Spirit with money, trying to obtain that through money. And this would be the purchasing of offices. Sometimes a bishop would have more than one bishopric. He would have 2 or even 3, depending on how influential he was. In the old movie, the clip which I'm showing here, you have a brother of one of these bishops coming to purchase another bishopric, because these were sources of income, sources of influence. And there's that temptation there. Now, you can see that clearly in this group and what happened in the case of Donnie Romero, one of their pastors. Now, when I say pastor, they would actually even call him a bishop as well, where he was overseeing a church in Texas, a church, I believe, in Oklahoma, and a church in Florida. And in doing so, I believe that the finances from these churches, he was involved in those as well. Now, he was then able to somehow secure access to these funds. And he used these funds for gambling in casinos, for prostitutes, and for drugs. It's almost unthinkable. And he even used the church's credit card, apparently, to purchase some of these things. So this man was able to do so and would have continued to do so, having no oversight. He would have continued to do so, I believe, if had not been for his wife, who outed him. I think it was to Stephen Anderson. So you have the possibility of abuse. The congregation is not truly in charge in these churches. They're not truly independent in that sense. It's not really a congregational church, because when this happened, you have an outsider coming in that just took over the church, took over the calling of another pastor. Whenever Donnie Romero was discovered in his activities and what he was doing, Stephen Anderson flew down to Fort Worth and assumed control. He assumed the preaching and the setting up of a new pastor.
Let me just start out by telling you what I think the plan should be, and then we can talk about that. And obviously it's a lot maybe for you guys to process since you just heard about this. Obviously you might want to sleep on things, and that's why I'm going to be here tomorrow and after that to talk to you. I'm going to be here Sunday morning and everything. But I think it's important that you guys get a new pastor in here right away. I think that's very important. Now, and so when the new guy comes in, okay, hopefully Jonathan Shelley, that's who I think it should be. But yes. I don't recommend that. I don't think that's a good idea. Now, I'll just repeat the question so everybody can hear it. He said, hey, can we vote on the next pastor? I can see having a vote if it were a situation where the church were kind of divided. Let's say the church are kind of divided and a bunch of people are kind of pushing for one thing, and a bunch of people are pushing for something else, and there's kind of like different sects in the church or different factions, and these people over here are pre-trib, and these people are post-trib, these people are kind of King James only, and these people aren't, or these people are for soul winning, these people aren't for soul winning. I could see if there was division, and if there was factions in the church, or if maybe it was someone questionable that were being brought in, and this guy's questionable, let's bring it to a vote. So if people are demanding a vote or something, then yeah, we could do that. I don't think that that's a good idea, because this isn't like a presidential election where people are running for office and we're voting for this guy or that guy. I don't believe in that kind of leadership. I don't believe in democracy. I believe that it's better if we can just kind of, come to a decision here and just without having an actual vote. Now, if it becomes necessary to have a vote, then yeah, you can vote on it. I don't think it's necessary. But if people are coming to me saying, "Hey, we don't want Jonathan Shelley as our pastor," then then it may come to that where we'll bring it to a vote. Does that make sense? Do you have anything to add, or does that satisfy you? Of the new pastor, Pastor Jonathan Shelley, and so we're excited to be able to have that. Now come, if you would, at this time, Brother Shelley. Amen. Amen. All right, this is your new pastor. Amen. I just want to say...
Now you can see that this church was basically coerced into accepting a new pastor approved by Stephen Anderson. Now, this was done almost immediately without much opportunity for any of the members or the deacons. I don't even know if they have deacons in these churches. You hardly ever hear of anything like that. There was hardly any opportunity to sit down and discuss the calling of a pastor, which leads us to the second point, the calling of the minister. A truly independent church will have the authority to call its own minister. Within these groups, the ministers are called from men within the congregation approved by their bishop, who, in the case of Donnie Romero, he would choose and ordain bishops. Jonathan Shelley would do the same thing. Stephen Anderson does the same thing, that they would pick somebody within the congregation and allow them to preach for a while, and then once they get good at their preaching, they would then be ordained into pastoring the church by this particular bishop or this pastor.
Okay? I'm the man of God here. I meet the qualifications. I run this church, and if you don't like it, then get out. This is a New Testament church. We have a bishop here. We have an overseer here. Like it or lump it. And if you don't like it, feel free to get up and leave the service at any time. And if you're
in a recent, there was recently another kerfuffle within the movement. There was apparently a discussion between Jonathan Shelley and one of his pastors that was at one time functioning as a preacher within the church. There was disagreement, and Pastor Shelley just simply dismissed the man.
Participating in all these other sins?
What do you mean other sins?
Well, I guess specifically whatever Romero was participating in, hookers and blow and everything else.
Well, the reason why I fired Fannin had nothing to do with any of that. The reason why I fired Fannin is because he was backstabbing me and lying to me and railing behind my back. And I had multiple witnesses call me and tell me that he was saying really negative things about me. And so that's the reason why I didn't even throw him out of the church. All I said is that he wasn't going to be preaching anymore. And then he basically just left the church and tried to split the church. I mean, frankly speaking, your preaching sucked and it was terrible. I can't just sit there and just let somebody keep preaching bad sermon after bad sermon be in charge. So that's why I removed you, and I've literally corrected you on so many different things of your preaching.
Well, that's not true. I asked you
and
what.
Even in the preaching class, you've only gotten some pretty harsh criticism.
Right. Yeah. You told me.
Class.
You told me once that.
I mean,
yeah.
There's multiple witnesses to all of that. Plus, how what you were saying was just wrong.
Right.
And in addition, yeah, I mean, obviously, I'm not going to try and just pick you apart because I thought maybe you're growing and you're trying.
Well, let me ask you: were my sermons prior to? I mean, but were the first sermons, the first 50, 60 sermons I preached, did they also suck?
I mean, I've not listened to all 50 or 60 sermons by
Did
any
you?
stretch of the imagination.
Well, you took
but I did
down
listen.
like 90% of them, so you must have listened to those, right?
I listened to several of your sermons, and I mean, you went through this Pride series, which was extremely.
These pastors are able to appoint preachers, to dismiss preachers, and then to ordain preachers within the churches, and they become pastors. Now, as I mentioned, I've never seen in an independent church anything like this, where you have one man able to do so. Now, where I have seen this is within the system of the Methodist Episcopals, Episcopalian Methodists, or however they're described, is where you have one man then appoints a pastor to a congregation, and then he has the power to move that pastor around in different congregations, or he can give the pastor several congregations within a district, but he has that authority to do so. You only see that there in the Episcopalian form of government. As an example, I was an assistant pastor on a rather large church back in the 80s and 90s for about 5 years. And during the course of that, the senior pastor and the founding pastor had died. He died suddenly. He was basically healthy. He did have some heart issues. He was in his 60s. But suddenly he just stood up, had a heart attack, and died. So the church then was left without a pastor. Me being there, along with another man on the staff, we assumed the role of interim pastor, and we were there for about a year or so. During this time, while we filled the pulpit, the church board got together and looked over candidates for pastor. I was approached on this. I turned it down. I believe I was too young at that time and inexperienced to accept a large church like that. The other pastor who was with me, he became one of the candidates. They brought in candidates from other areas. The church was part of a denomination. It was an independent church, but as part of a denomination, received some advice from the district superintendents, who was also the district superintendent, was one of the candidates. He gave some advice. The church decided not to go with his advice, and they finally called another man who was the son of the previous pastor. This man had pastored there before and an assistant role, and was able then to come into the church. But the church took a long time to go over all of the candidates. They took time to examine the pastor. They looked at his doctrine. What do you believe? And they had to decide, can we accept this man based on what he believes? And over the course of a year, they finally determined that to call this man, they did. And the man remained there, and he's still there. He's now looking at retirement. It's been over 20 some years now. So when it's done properly, you're not going to have this chaos. And the church has input. The church was able to, the elders of the church, or what they were called stewards there, being a Methodist church, they were able then to examine the man and have an input. They just simply, we didn't have somebody come in and say, this is your new pastor, and force a vote, or whatever to give. I think that you should do this. No, this pastor, we had the general superintendent or the district superintendent came in and said, here's the options, here's what you're able to do. He even offered himself as one of the candidates, but he was not chosen because the congregation and the board were the ones that held the authority, and they're the ones that took the time to examine the pastor. So after 28 years, that pastor remains and has a very successful ministry without much of the drama. There was some issues at the beginning because some of the board didn't want this pastor. They wanted somebody else, and they eventually left. There's going to be some of this turmoil that may occur. The final point to look into is in the area of church discipline. The new IFB, they have what they call a form of church discipline, where the pastor just simply makes a unilateral decision to toss somebody out of the church. And as we've seen in the introduction, some of the clips, and there's many others you could point out, where people have just been thrown out of the church because the pastor felt that the person was a reprobate or the person had done something to deserve being tossed out.
here has texted people without coming to me. Look, if he had a problem with my doctrine, shouldn't he have come to me? Yes. Or should he be going behind my back and backbiting, going to other church members who never asked his opinion, mind you, never even asked and said, hey, Chris, what do you think about Pastor Anderson's sermon? He just texts them because he saw them on YouTube defending me. So because they were on YouTube defending me, he takes it upon himself to rebuke them for defending the pastor of his church, calls my statements wicked and evil. And listen, this, I know your faggoty buddy, Afshin Yaktin, lets everybody get up and say whatever they want. But in this church, it's not a free-for-all. It's not an open mic. You don't come to this church and pretend to be a faithful member of the church while you're going behind the pastor's back. Did you ever have the guts to confront me with that, Chris? Huh? Did you ever have the guts to confront me with that, Chris? No, you didn't. You didn't have the guts, you coward. You're like Judas. You want to go behind my back. I want you to get up and get out of this church right now. Yeah. Get out of here. Get out. Right now. Get out of here. You need to ask your advice. Pick him up and get him out of here if he won't leave.
Well, there are several actual channels now on YouTube of some of these people who have been tossed out of the new IFB. The problem there is that this is not church discipline at all. There's no trial before their peers within the church. A church is going to have a member within a church is going to have opportunity to give his side before the church board, be questioned by the church board. The person bringing the accusation would be questioned, and the validity of the accusation would have to be determined. Is that an actual sin that this person needs to be confronted by? So there are many things that happen within church discipline. Church discipline is not something that happens frequently within churches. Sometimes there should be a lot more within churches. Many churches don't even practice discipline at all. But these men within this group assume an apostolic authority to be able to look into the hearts of men and then to throw them out according to their own decisions. In some supernatural way, they're able to determine the hearts of these men. And they can then declare them reprobate. Now, Matthew 18 gives us the steps to do this. 1 Corinthians chapter 5 shows us an example of how this was done. And Galatians chapter 6 tells us how this is to be done. Galatians 6 and verse 1, Brethren, if a man is overtaken in any trespass, you who are spiritual, restore such a one in a spirit of gentleness, considering yourself, lest you also be tempted. You know that you don't see these physical altercations that you see within the NIFB in a normal church. You don't see them within the scriptures. Now you see Ananias and Sapphira under the apostolic authority of Peter, who was able to tell that they were lying to the Holy Spirit. How can someone tell that? Apparently Peter didn't have all the information. What he did have was the information coming from the Holy Spirit himself that revealed this to Peter, and Peter was led then to declare what was going to happen to Ananias and then to his wife Sapphira. He knew that as an apostle. These men assume, in the new IFB, assume that they have this apostolic authority, which I think is a very dangerous thing, which is also another sign of a cult. As this group does not have true Christian doctrine at its foundation, it will function more as the Watchtower Society than as a church of the Lord Jesus Christ when it comes to this area of discipline. There's going to be the spirit of meanness, the spirit of Phariseeism, the ability to physically throw somebody out of a church. As you see, that's their idea of church discipline, just as simply to get the guys together, open the door, and toss the guy out. No, you need to go through the steps of Matthew 18. You need to follow the example of 1 Corinthians 5 and the spirit of Galatians chapter 6. And approaching this with gentleness, recognizing that you yourself are susceptible to these same sins. So that in concluding all of this, if you are a member of this cult, and that somehow you have stumbled upon this video. Now, I know that these pastors are going to do everything they can to keep you away from hearing this video. I am a horrible reprobate, and anybody like me who would dare question them is a horrible reprobate. So if you have stumbled across this video, I believe you are being led by the Spirit of God to do so. I don't expect to have very large numbers of people watching these videos, but these videos are here for a person who just simply may be searching, who sees some of these horrible things happening within this group or any extreme fundamentalist group, and they're looking for answers. If you're one of those people, let me give you the advice that the only thing that you can do, and it's a very difficult thing, is to get out. I would not stick around and try to reform this group. Some churches you can do that. But this particular group, as I've mentioned, has already left the basic fundamentals of Christianity. They don't even have a Christian foundation anymore. And the only thing you can do is leave and find a church that does. Now, if you need to contact me, I have my email address in the description. If you have any questions or comments, you can leave them in the comment section. I may be contacted by email. That is in the description. And may the Lord bless you in your search for truth.